Most mornings, the world felt simple to me, just the soft whistle of my line cutting the air, and the calm ripples spreading across the pond as the sun rose. That pond was my sanctuary, the one place I could breathe. But on this morning, everything was wrong. The silence was broken by the stench of chemicals so sharp it burned my nose. Fish floated lifeless on the surface, their scales catching the morning light like broken glass. And then I saw it, streaks of bright, unnatural blue slicing through the water. I knew instantly this wasn't natural. I'd spent my life protecting waters like this, and the signs were clear. Someone had poisoned the pond. Standing there with my rod in hand, I felt anger crawl through me. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. Whoever did this wasn't just killing a pond, they were threatening my community. And I was going to find out who. The stench lingered in my nostrils as I paced the bank, staring at the devastation, my sanctuary ruined. Basin bluegill that I'd watched grow over the years now drifted like pale shadows beneath the surface. Some floated belly up, others bobbed in slow circles, as if mocking the life that had been stolen from them. I crouched near the edge, careful not to touch the water, and that's when I noticed it more clearly. Streaks of blue cutting through the shallows, not algae, not pollen. I knew exactly what it was. Copper, sulfate, a chemical used to wipe out algae blooms when ponds got overrun. In tiny amounts, sure, it could help. But this was no tiny dose. This was an execution. Whoever dumped it in had known exactly what they were doing. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just vandalism or some careless neighbor tossing junk into the water. Copper sulfate came in bulk, used by professionals or contractors. Someone planned this. Someone wanted the pond dead. As the thought burned in my mind, I turned back toward my house, hoping to clear my head. That's when I saw it, a bright yellow envelope taped right to my front door, my name scrawled across it in bold black ink. I ripped it open and felt my jaw tighten. A violation notice from the HOA, environmental damage, $150 fine. The paper was signed by Margaret Voss, the HOA president herself. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the fine. It was the date. The notice was dated yesterday, a full day before the fish had started floating, before the chemicals even had time to spread. How could Margaret accuse me of damage that hadn't even happened yet? Unless she already knew it was coming. I stared at the letter again, reading it 3 times over. There were no warnings, no hearings, all steps required by the HOA handbook. She'd skipped them, gone straight for punishment. Straight for me. For 3 years, I'd lived here without issue. I followed every rule, cut my grass, even picked up trash that others left behind near the pond. I was no troublemaker, and everyone knew it, so why target me now? The answer kept circling back to the same name, Margaret. She was polished, sharp-tongued, and always chasing property values. The kind of person who smiled with her teeth but not her eyes. I'd seen her strut through neighborhood meetings in her real estate blazer, waving charts about home prices like scripture, and she never hid her contempt for me, the guy with muddy boots, who spent his mornings fishing instead of manicuring lawns. But this fine wasn't just petty harassment. It felt like a setup, a trap. I walked back to the pond. Notice crumpled in my hand, scanning the water again. Dead fish, blue streaks, the smell of chemicals. Then I thought about the envelope waiting for me before the poison even hit. Margaret had been one step ahead, almost too far ahead. That's when the thought hit me like a cold stone in my gut. Maybe this wasn't about me at all. Maybe the pond was just the first piece in something bigger. And if that was true, then Margaret knew more than she was letting on. I didn't waste any time. With the violation notice still crumpled in my hand, I marched straight to Margaret Voss's house. Every step across the pavement fueled my anger. She lived in one of those spotless corner homes with perfect hedges, the kind of place that screamed control. Her car sat gleaming in the driveway, a real estate agency decal plastered on the bumper. Of course, I knocked hard enough to rattle the frame. For a moment, I thought she'd ignore me, but then the door opened, and there she stood. Perfect hair, polished suit, fake smile. She looked more like she was heading to a property showing than answering her front door. "Well, Ethan," she said, voice dripping with false sweetness. "I was wondering when you'd come by." I held the notice up between us. "You fined me for environmental damage. Dated yesterday." Funny thing, Margaret, the pond wasn't poisoned until this morning. Care to explain how you knew it was coming? Her eyes flickered, just for a second, before she smoothed them over with that plastic expression. "Your fishing has been degrading the pond for years. It was only a matter of time before we saw the consequences." I laughed, though it wasn't from humor. I've cleaned up more trash from that pond than anyone else in this neighborhood. I know those waters like the back of my hand. What happened out there wasn't natural, it was deliberate. She crossed her arms, tilting her head with a smirk. "Maybe you're not as much of an expert as you think. Fish die, ecosystems collapse. And frankly, Ethan, this neighborhood doesn't need a fisherman dragging down its property values." There it was, the line she couldn't resist slipping out. Property values. Always her obsession. But then she added something that made my chest tighten. "This pond won't be our concern much longer anyway. Big changes are coming, changes that will benefit everyone." Well, everyone willing to adapt. Big changes. I caught the words like a hook snagging my shirt. I pressed forward. What changes? What are you planning? Her smile thinned into something colder. That's HOA business, not something for residents to meddle in. My advice? Ethan, pay your fine, stop stirring up trouble, and maybe consider fishing elsewhere. I felt heat rising in my chest. You're trying to frame me for something you did, and you think I'll just walk away? Not a chance. Her expression slipped. For the first time, irritation flashing in her eyes. Careful with your accusations. You wouldn't want to make things harder for yourself. That was it. The warning beneath the politeness. She wanted me scared. She wanted me silent. But I wasn't about to back down. If you're not hiding anything, then you won't mind if I request an independent investigation into the pond. Right. Water testing, environmental reports, the works. Her jaw tightened, though she quickly covered it with a chuckle. Oh, Ethan, always so dramatic. You can waste your time if you want, but the HOA has already decided what's best for this community, and trust me, you're not part of that plan. She closed the door before I could answer, leaving me standing there with my fists clenched at my sides. As I walked back home, her words echoed in my head. Big changes are coming. And the way she said it, like the pond was just an obstacle, not a tragedy, told me this went far beyond a fine or a personal grudge. Something was happening behind the scenes. Something bigger, and I wasn't going to stop until I found out what it was. The next morning I went back to the pond. I couldn't shake Margaret's words from my head. Big changes are coming. Every instinct in me screamed that she wasn't talking about natural shifts or some minor policy tweak. She had a plan, and the pond was in the middle of it. As I walked the familiar path around the bank, I noticed things I hadn't before. Fresh piles of soil stacked near the far end of the water, deep grooves in the ground, like heavy equipment had been driven through recently, and pipes, large PVC pipes, half buried, snaking down toward the water's edge. I crouched to take a closer look. These weren't maintenance pipes. They were drainage lines, the kind developers install when they are preparing to redirect water. My gut clenched. This wasn't about algae. It wasn't even about me. Margaret was preparing the pond for something far bigger, maybe draining it, maybe repurposing it. Either way, it meant destruction. I pulled out my phone, snapping a few photos, but the unease only grew heavier. If she'd already brought in equipment and materials, this wasn't some future idea. It was already in motion by the time I got back to my house. A new notice had been shoved under my door. This one was a flyer. Emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance. Scheduled for that same evening, barely 6 hours away. Illegal. HOA bylaws required at least 5 days' notice before any special meeting. She was breaking rules left and right, and no one seemed willing to stop her. That night, I walked into the community center and felt the tension crackling like static. Around 30 residents were packed into the room, whispering, frowning, exchanging nervous glances. Some looked at me like I was already guilty of something. Margaret had clearly been working overtime, poisoning more than just the pond. She'd poisoned opinions to dot. Her assistant, a tall man in a navy suit, stopped me at the door. Residents are welcome, he said with a thin smile, but only board members may participate in the discussion. You'll need to sit in the back. I clenched my teeth but didn't argue. Fine, let her talk. I'd listen. Margaret stood at the podium in her perfect blazer, hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She greeted the room like a politician, thanking everyone for acting quickly to address this environmental disaster. Then she gestured toward a series of posters she'd pinned up, blown-up photos of the dead fish, the blue streaks, even a shot of me standing at the water's edge. She didn't waste time. This contamination is the direct result of one resident's reckless fishing practices, she announced, her voice sharp, confident. And unless we take decisive action, property values will plummet. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. I felt my stomach twist, but I stayed quiet. Then came the real punch. She held up a paper, calling it a community pledge. It banned fishing permanently and gave the HOA authority to pursue development opportunities for the pond area. All she needed were signatures. I raised my hand from the back. That pledge isn't legal. HOA bylaws require environmental studies, community votes, and proper hearings before you can change land use. You can't just decide this on your own. Her smile cracked for the briefest moment before she snapped back. I decide what's best for this community. Maybe if you cared about more than your fishing line, you'd understand that. But it wasn't just what she said next that shook me, it was what I overheard. She leaned toward her assistant, whispering, "We'll need the development paperwork ready, and make sure the contaminated water documentation is filed before the city's review." My blood ran cold. This wasn't about fish. This wasn't about property values. This was a scheme, and Margaret was orchestrating every move. From the back row, I could feel 30 pairs of eyes on me, heavy with suspicion. Margaret didn't have to point fingers. She'd already painted me as the villain. Her voice carried across the room with a rehearsed rhythm, the kind that makes lies sound like gospel. "This community deserves better," she said, holding the pledge high. "We cannot allow one man's reckless habits to destroy our shared resources. If we don't act, the pond will remain contaminated, children could get sick, and property values will nosedive. Every sentence was a dagger, aimed at me. People shifted in their seats, whispering. A few looked back toward me, their expressions torn between doubt and anger. Margaret's assistant passed out copies of the pledge, moving row by row like it was already decided. I raised my voice. That pledge is nothing but a land grab. It bans fishing, yes, but look closely at the fine print. It gives the HOA permission to explore development opportunities. That means bulldozers. That means concrete. The pond you've all enjoyed for years, gone. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some neighbors leaned closer to their papers, frowning. Margaret slammed her palm against the podium, her mask slipping for a moment. Do not listen to him. He is the one responsible for this disaster, and now he's trying to derail the solution. Typical. I stood, holding up the violation notice she'd left on my door. Then explain this. Margaret, you fined me for environmental damage yesterday. Before the fish even died. How could you have known what was coming? Her face froze, the room falling into silence. She recovered quickly, flashing a sharp smile. That notice was a clerical error. The board has to anticipate issues in order to act quickly. It was a flimsy excuse, and a few people in the crowd seemed to sense it. But she pressed on, flooding the silence before anyone could question further. The truth is simple. Ethan's fishing has damaged this pond. He refuses to take responsibility, and now he's inventing conspiracies to save himself. But the evidence is in the water. You saw the photos? Her assistant chimed in, voice deep and authoritative. It's time we protect our neighborhood. Sign the pledge tonight, and we'll begin cleanup immediately. Hands started moving pens across paper. My chest tightened as I watched signature after signature fall in line. Margaret had them wrapped around her finger. Then, from the middle of the crowd, a voice broke through. Hold on. It was Paul Turner, a gray-haired man I recognized. A former HOA board member. He stood slowly, adjusting his glasses. Before anyone signs anything, we need independent water testing. If Ethan's right, this wasn't caused by fishing. And if Margaret's right, then the tests will prove her case. Either way, we deserve the truth. The room stirred with uneasy agreement. Margaret's smile thinned, her nails tapping against the podium. Independent testing is unnecessary. We already have experts lined up. Paul cut her off. Experts you hired. That's not independence. Margaret, that's a conflict of interest. Gasps rippled across the room. Margaret's eyes blazed. For a second, then she laughed, though the sound was brittle. Paul, you're out of line. You're not even on the board anymore. He shot back calmly. Maybe not, but I still live here, and I care about the truth. Margaret's mask slipped again, just for a heartbeat. She leaned toward her assistant, whispering harshly, the developer needs contamination proof by next week. We can't afford delays. She thought no one heard, but I did, and so did Paul. My pulse hammered as I sat back down. This wasn't just harassment. This was a scheme, a plot big enough to poison the pond, to poison trust, all for profit. And if we didn't stop her soon, it would be too late. After the meeting, I slipped out the back, my head pounding with everything I'd just heard. Paul caught up with me in the parking lot, his old leather shoes scuffing against the pavement. You heard it too, didn't you? He said, lowering his voice. I nodded. She mentioned the developer. That wasn't for the community's benefit. That was for her pocket. Paul rubbed his chin, eyes narrowing. Exactly. And this isn't the first time she's pulled something like this. When I was on the board, Margaret pushed for new safety upgrades. Cost the neighborhood nearly 50 grand. A month later, the contractor who got the job turned out to be her brother-in-law. The weight of his words settled like a stone in my gut. This was bigger than me, bigger than a dead pond. So, what do we do? If she controls the board and the HOA funds, she's untouchable. Paul gave me a sharp look. Not if we can prove fraud, but we'll need evidence. Paper trails, contracts, emails. Something she can't spin with her fake speeches. I exhaled, a mix of dread and determination tightening my chest. Where do we start? He smirked faintly. With her assistant? That man carries more folders than a courthouse clerk. If she's careless, he's holding the smoking gun. The next evening, Paul and I staked out the HOA office, a bland, windowless building by the park. Margaret's car was already there, sleek and black, the kind of vehicle that screamed control. We waited until her assistant stepped out for a smoke. His tie loosened, a folder tucked under his arm. Paul nudged me. Opportunity. We approached casually, as though just passing by. I forced a smile. Long night. The assistant stiffened, eyes darting. Just board business. Nothing for you to worry about. Paul leaned in, voice smooth but heavy. Funny thing about board business. It tends to become everyone's business when money's missing. The man's grip tightened on his folder. For a second, I thought he'd bolt. Instead, he flicked his cigarette to the ground and hissed, "You don't know what you're messing with. Margaret has deals lined up that'll change this whole neighborhood." Deals, I pressed. He realized his slip too late. His lips clamped shut, and he shoved past us, muttering, "Stay out of it if you know what's good for you." But that one word, deals, confirmed everything. Later that night, Paul and I set up in my garage, spreading out notes across the workbench. Paul's hands shook slightly as he scribbled dates and names. Developers don't touch properties. without incentive. She's offering them something, maybe rezoning, maybe easy. But to do that, she has to show the pond is unusable. That means faking contamination. I stared at the photos Margaret had waved around during the meeting. Dead fish, cloudy water, oily streaks. If this was staged, she had to dump something in there, and if she dumped something, there's residue somewhere. Containers, invoices, delivery slips. Paul cut in. Exactly. If we find proof she tampered with the pond, she's finished. Not just as HOA president, legally finished. The garage went quiet for a moment. The hum of the old fridge filled the space. My hands clenched into fists. Then tomorrow, we start digging. In the water, in the office, wherever we have to. Because if she thinks she can ruin this place for money, she's got another thing coming. Paul gave a slow nod. Careful, Ethan. Margaret isn't just power hungry. She's dangerous. You corner her, she lash out. I met his gaze, steady and cold. Then let her. I'm done being her scapegoat. It's time we turned the tables. The conspiracy was no longer a suspicion, it was real. And now, I had an ally. Together, we were going to bring Margaret down no matter what it took. The plan wasn't perfect. In fact, it wasn't much of a plan at all, just desperation stitched together with stubborn resolve. But by the time midnight rolled around, Paul and I were crouched in the shadow of the HOA office, adrenaline beating like war drums in my veins. Last chance to back out, Paul whispered, his breath fogging in the cool night air. I shook my head. She framed me, poisoned the pond, and thinks she can bully this whole neighborhood into silence. I'm not backing down. Paul gave a faint smile, one that mixed admiration with weariness. All right then, let's make this quick. The office wasn't exactly Fort Knox. A side window gave way with a little pressure, and the edge of a crowbar Paul had borrowed from his garage. The faint creak of wood echoed like thunder in my ears as I slipped inside, landing on a cheap carpet that smelled faintly of dust and cleaning chemicals. The place was quiet, the kind of sterile silence that made every sound dangerous. We flicked on our flashlights, beams slicing through the darkness. Rows of filing cabinets lined one wall, the glow catching on brass labels, budgets, contracts, legal, miscellaneous. Start with contracts, Paul muttered, already pulling open a drawer. We worked quickly, fingers rifling through stacks of paper. Most of it was mundane, landscaping fees, trash pickup schedules, parking lot repairs. But then I found it, a thick folder stamped with a real estate company's logo. Inside, letters of intent, drafts of agreements, and one line that made my stomach drop. Proposal for future development, acquisition of common grounds adjacent to Evergreen Pond. Paul, I whispered, shoving the papers toward him. His eyes widened as he read, his jaw tightening. She's selling the pond, he said flatly. Not just the pond, the land around it. To a developer. I flipped through the stack, heart hammering. Dates, signatures, projected profits. And right there, clear as day, Margaret Voss's name on several preliminary approvals. She'd been negotiating behind everyone's backs for months. Paul exhaled slowly. This is it. Proof. But before we could celebrate, a faint sound froze us both. A click, the unmistakable sound of a door unlocking. I killed the flashlight, instantly, and we ducked behind a row of cabinets, hearts pounding. The office door creaked open, spilling a sliver of yellow light across the carpet. Footsteps followed, measured and deliberate. Through the narrow gap, I caught sight of a shadow, crossing the room. Then her voice, Margaret's. Don't think I don't know what you're up to, Ethan. Her tone was low, venomous, directed into the darkness. Paul's hand gripped my arm. She knows. Margaret moved further inside, the click of her heels, sharp against the floor. You think you can play detective, sniffing around where you don't belong? But you're just one man, and men like you break. She paused, as if savoring her own words. Then the footsteps retreated, and the door slammed shut again. Silence. I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Paul leaned close, whispering, She knows. He knows we're onto her. My fists clenched around the folder in my hands. Good, let her know, because now, I've got proof. We slipped out the window minutes later, nerves stretched taut, the stolen documents tucked safely inside my jacket. That night, as I spread the papers across my kitchen table, the truth stared back at me in black and white. Margaret wasn't just corrupt, she was ruthless, and she wasn't afraid to play dirty. But for the first time since this started, I felt like I had the upper hand, and I was ready to use it. The next morning, I awoke to the sharp knock of authority. At my front door, still groggy from a restless night, I opened it to find a uniformed sheriff's deputy standing on my porch, expression unreadable. He handed me a thick envelope. Ethan Cole, he asked. Yes, you've been served. But words hit like a punch. Inside the envelope was a lawsuit, harassment, trespassing, illegal surveillance, all filed by Margaret Voss. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in my kitchen, as I skimmed through the accusations. She claimed I had been stalking her, breaking into HOA property, even threatening her safety. Every word was a lie, but lies written in legal ink had a way of looking legitimate. Paul called minutes later. His voice was tight. You get served too? Yeah, she's trying to bury us in paperwork. Same here. She's coming at both of us. Margaret had moved quickly, faster than I thought possible. By noon, neighbors I'd known for years wouldn't meet my eyes. Parents pulled their kids closer as I walked by, whispers following in my wake. Somehow, overnight, I had become the villain of the community. It didn't take long to find out why. A flyer appeared in every mailbox, printed on glossy paper with the HOA letterhead. Across the top in bold letters, "Protect our neighborhood from sabotage." Beneath it was a picture of me, taken from God knows where, standing at the pond with my fishing gear. The text painted me as reckless, careless, even dangerous. According to Margaret, I was the reason the pond was poisoned. According to her, my fishing had introduced toxins that threatened the safety of families. It was slander, pure and simple, but people believed it. Fear always finds willing ears. That night, my phone buzzed with messages, some from supportive friends, but most from angry neighbors. "How could you do this to us? My daughter's been sick. This is on you. Leave before you ruin anything else." Each word felt like a nail sealing me into a coffin Margaret had built. When Paul stopped by, his face was pale. "She's not just trying to ruin your name, she's poisoning the well, literally and figuratively. The developers are already circling." I heard from a buddy in zoning that Lakeside Development has a meeting with city planners next week. If they convince the council this water's contaminated, they'll fast-track the resort. I slammed my fist against the table. She's willing to destroy her own neighborhood for a payout, and now she's trying to destroy me too. Paul leaned in, lowering his voice. Then we hit back harder. We don't just defend ourselves, we expose her. His words lit a fire in me, but it didn't erase the weight pressing on my chest. Every step Margaret took pulled more people into her web. Even the water tasted metallic when I turned on my tap, a faint reminder of what was at stake. Later that night, as I sat by the pond with my fishing rod untouched beside me, I thought about giving up, maybe moving out, maybe letting her win. But then I remembered the look on Mrs. Lynn's face at the meeting, her sick daughter leaning against her shoulder. I remembered the fish belly up, stripped of life by greed. Margaret could smear my name, serve me with lawsuits, and try to turn everyone against me. But she couldn't take the truth, and I wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. Just when I thought Margaret's smear campaign might break me, Paul showed up at my door late one night. He looked exhausted, but his eyes carried a spark of triumph I hadn't seen in weeks. "I've got something," he said, gripping a folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. I let him in, and he spread the papers across my kitchen table. My heart pounded as I scanned the first page. Emails. Dozens of them. "These were leaked by someone on the inside at Lakeside Development," Paul explained. "I can't tell you who, but they had access. And Ethan, it's worse than we thought." I leaned closer, my hands shaking as I read the words. Margaret had been in contact with Lakeside for months, negotiating payouts in exchange for evidence of contamination. One email even spelled it out clearly, $50,000. Wired upon proof that the pond is unsafe for residential use? My stomach dropped. "She sold us out." Paul nodded grimly. "She poisoned the pond herself, then blamed you, and the money? It's already in her account." Another email made my blood run cold. "Documentation must be provided by next week for zoning approval. Ensure community perception aligns with contamination narrative. Community perception, that meant us, the neighbors she had manipulated into turning against me. She wasn't just fabricating contamination. She was staging an entire illusion to push her agenda through. I rubbed my face, trying to process the weight of it all. "This is the smoking gun, Paul, but how do we use it? She's already got the HOA, half the town, and now the court's on her side." Paul's jaw tightened. "We go public. No more quiet meetings, no more whispers. We lay this out for everyone to see, a water test, open to the community. If they see the truth with their own eyes, they won't be able to ignore it." The thought sent a chill through me. Public confrontation wasn't my style. I was a fisherman, not a fighter, but Margaret had left me no choice. She'd poisoned my pond, my reputation, and nearly my will to fight. I looked back at the emails. Phrases like contamination, narrative, and expedited resort development stared back at me. Every word was evidence of her betrayal. I thought of Mrs. Lynn's sick daughter, of the metallic taste in my own tap water, of the neighbors too scared to speak up. This wasn't just about me anymore. "She wants contamination," I muttered. "Let's show her what real contamination looks like. Not her staged lies, but the truth. We'll test the water in front of everyone. We'll make sure there's no denying who's behind this." Paul smiled for the first time in days. "Exactly, and I've already lined someone up. Jake Matthews, water safety expert, works with the county sometimes. He's legit, and people respect him." The plan formed quickly. A community picnic, disguised as a friendly gathering but with one clear goal: expose Margaret's scheme in broad daylight. We'd invite everyone, families, parents, even local reporters if possible. And when Jake revealed the results, the truth would finally surface. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope cutting through the haze of frustration. Margaret had her lawsuits and her lies, but we had something stronger: proof. Still, As I stared at those emails long after Paul left, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret wouldn't go down quietly. She'd built her empire on manipulation and intimidation. And when cornered, people like her didn't just surrender. They struck back harder. But I was ready. The morning of the picnic felt like the calm before a storm. I stood by the pond with folding tables, coolers, and borrowed tents, trying to make it look like nothing more than a neighborly gathering. But beneath the surface, this was war. Today, Margaret's lies would finally face the truth. Paul arrived early, carrying the folder of emails like a weapon. Behind him came Jake Matthews, hauling his water testing kit. He gave me a firm nod. We'll let the science do the talking. Neighbors trickled in, curiosity written all over their faces. Some avoided me, still believing Margaret's flyers. Others came out of sheer concern, mothers pushing strollers, retirees with folding chairs, kids chasing each other along the grass. By noon, nearly half the neighborhood had gathered, and then she arrived. Margaret, perfectly dressed as always, clipboard in hand, flanked by her assistant and two men in business suits I didn't recognize. They carried briefcases and a smugness that made my blood boil. She smiled sweetly, voice dripping with false charm. How lovely, a little picnic. Shame it's under such unfortunate circumstances. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Jake was already setting up his kit, pulling out test tubes and vials, laying them neatly for everyone to see. The sight of it made the crowd murmur. Margaret clapped her hands for attention. Before we begin, I've hired independent consultants to perform their tests. We must ensure accuracy. After all, her two suits stepped forward, flashing badges from some private environmental firm. It was a power play, meant to undermine us, but Jake didn't flinch. Science isn't about sides, he said firmly. It's about results. And the results will speak for themselves. The crowd hushed as Jake knelt by the water's edge, carefully filling his first vial. He explained each step, testing for copper, testing for heavy metals, comparing against EPA standards. His voice carried calm authority, and I watched as even the skeptics leaned in to listen. When the results appeared, the gasp from the crowd was deafening. Copper sulfate levels were 15 times higher than what the EPA considered safe. Lead and mercury showed up too, toxic enough to make the pond dangerous not just for fish, but for humans. This pond didn't die naturally, Jake said, his voice sharp. It was deliberately poisoned. All eyes turned to Margaret. She laughed nervously, waving to her consultants. See, that's why we need professionals. This isn't proof of sabotage. It's simply an aging pond in need of modernization. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Mrs. Lynn stepped forward, holding her daughter's hand. Her voice cracked with emotion. My child has been sick for weeks. Are you saying that's just modernization too? Whispers rippled through the neighbors, suspicion turning into anger. That's when Paul stepped up, holding the folder of emails high. And what about this? He read aloud, word by word. Margaret's deal with Lakeside Development, the $50,000 payout. The demand for proof of contamination. The plan to push through resort permits before anyone could object. Margaret's smile collapsed. She lunged for the papers, but Paul pulled them back. A paralegal neighbor examined them on the spot, confirming they were authentic. The crowd erupted. Shouts of fraud and resign rang out. Margaret raised her hands, desperate. This is being taken out of context. Property values matter. I did this for all of you, but her words were drowned out by the roar of betrayal from the people she had manipulated for so long. For the first time, Margaret looked cornered, truly cornered, and I knew this wasn't just the end of her scheme. It was the beginning of her downfall. The moment Margaret's mask slipped, everything unraveled. The crowd that once looked at me with suspicion now turned their fury on her. But Margaret wasn't done with her performance. In a final, desperate act, she marched to the fountain by the community center, scooped a cup of water, and raised it high. You see, she shouted, voice trembling, it's safe. Before anyone could stop her, she drank it. For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, her face twisted. She staggered, clutching her throat, and collapsed to the ground as chaos erupted. Paramedics rushed in, neighbors screamed, and I felt a grim truth settle in my chest. She'd been undone by her own poison. Within hours, federal agents arrived. The EPA tested the pond and confirmed everything Jake had revealed. What Margaret had done wasn't just corruption, it was a federal crime. Water contamination carried heavy penalties, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift. Margaret faced charges that could carry years behind bars. She lost her position, her reputation, and the support of the very neighbors she'd manipulated. Lakeside Development pulled out, terrified of being tied to a scandal. Meanwhile, our community came together. Paul was voted interim president of the HOA, and the first thing he did was push for transparency. No more secret meetings, no more hidden agendas. We established water monitoring, regular reports, and open voting on major decisions. The pond was declared a protected space, and volunteers worked alongside county officials to begin the long cleanup for me. The fight had been exhausting. Lawsuits, lies, betrayal. But one evening, weeks later, I stood by the pond again. The water wasn't perfect yet, but life was returning. Tiny ripples shimmered under the setting sun, and I cast my line into the water, the way I used to. This time, though, it wasn't just about fishing, it was about justice. About proving that one voice, backed by truth, could stand up against greed and corruption. Margaret's scheme had poisoned more than a pond, it had poisoned trust. But together, we reclaimed it. And, as I reeled in my line, I realized something simple. The pond was alive again, and so was our community.